Hello everyone and welcome to this video. So this is a follow-up. So as last month I did a review, a mini analysis of all the films that I had watched in October. And that was positively received. So I'm going to continue it and I'm going to talk about all the films that I watched in November. So in November, I watched a few more films than I did in October. So I'm going to give some little reviews and little thoughts on all of them and little ideas as to how we can unpick and discuss them. So on the 1st of November, my first film, I went to the cinema with Mrs. Goodall and I watched Chris Stuckman's Shelby Oaks. So Chris Stuckman, the YouTube reviewer, crowdfunded a horror film, and the film is it's about a woman whose sister has disappeared and sort of points in the past, and her sister is sort of looking for her, and as a result of sort of some documentary, a new lead appears and the woman pursues it. This film, I had sort of quite a mixed response to this film. It opened with sort of a found footage style, which I found really quite compelling. I liked the found footage elements of it, but then it pivoted away from that into a more sort of conventional horror film, and I think it worked less effectively than I'd have liked. Some excellent jumpy moments, some interesting world building and mythos, and the central performance by Camille Sullivan, who plays Mia, the sister of the missing YouTuber. She's really, really good. So there's lots of stuff that I liked here, and when it sort of plays with that aesthetic and it's sort of hiding things in the frame, it works quite well. And I fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's sort of almost essentially sort of bog standard horror film. For a first time filmmaker, it's worth stressing that that is no bad thing. I mean, kudos to Stuckman for pulling this together, and as a first time director. There's an evident love for the genre, sort of certain set pieces, the appearance of a figure in the background of a shot, a videotape of sort of the missing sister going to a sort of abandoned fairground, for example, is really great, and the great shot as well of sort of a demon that appears in a TV screen. So there's sort of punchy elements. By and large, I think the film was really kind of distinctly average almost. I don't know, I could say fairer or more than that. So let's shift ahead. On the 6th, then, I watched Predator, Killer of Killers. I watched this with a view of maybe going to watch the new Predator film. I never got round to doing that. This is an animated film, and it's set in 3 time periods. So it's set in Viking times, it's set in feudal Japan, and it's set during World War II. And it sees essentially warriors in all of these periods pursued, hunted by the predator, followed by sort of a 4th act shift that I am not going to give away. I liked this one. I liked the animated style. It looked beautiful and sort of it contained all the visceral gore and sort of brutal killing that you'd want really from a Predator film. I quite liked sort of the characterization of the 3 main characters, all of whom were sort of very, very interesting in their own right, and all of whom fought the Predator in different ways. And it was fantastic. There was some sort of brilliant kills and shots that you'd never really be able to do in a live action film without it making it look essentially overly CGI'd and rubbish. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it worked really well. The animation was beautiful, and the storylines of the characters were beautiful. And they were sort of very compelling. There were some sort of Easter eggy moments that I didn't love, but by and large, this was a really worthy addition to the franchise. And I think certainly one of the strongest Predator films. Nothing tops the original, of course. But this painted a picture of I could see the world developing in this way, and would not grumble at it developing in this way. I think that would be quite a fantastic, exciting way to take the franchise moving forward. Although, of course, knowing that the current Predator film has done so well, anyhow, means we'll see. Who knows? The future for the franchise is looking bright, I think. We shift ahead. So on the 9th, I watched as a result of a Ryan Hollinger video that I saw released about a scene in it, and I'll put a link to that video down below. I watched Men, a 24 film, starring Jessie Buckley. As a widowed woman, she travels to a country village to sort of get away from everything, and is disturbed and bothered by sort of the weird men who are in the village. And they're all played by Rory Kinnear, which is, sort of, it's a weird, quite unsettling film, I thought. I'll be honest. So there's in the film there is two sort of thematic ideas in play, I think. So one is about sort of male violence, masculine violence, and the other is to do with sort of folk horror. The Jessie Buckley character, her husband, is sort of this negative character who sort of abuses and manipulates her and then dies. And then when she arrives in the village, all of these men are sort of similarly sort of terrible men. There's a lot of folk horror things. I'm thinking a lot of folk horror at the moment. I've submitted an abstract to a book that will be, we'll hear from that down the line, and we'll discuss that if it is accepted. This is my view on the film, though, is that it's not quite as profound, almost. It's not quite as deep and successful in subtextual dimensions as it aims to be. There's a definite lack of subtlety, and sort of, your views on that may differ as to whether that's relevant or whether that sort of impacts. And it culminates in sort of a sort of a baffling, very protracted and sort of body horror finale that I won't spoil much more than that. This is a film that I think was balancing some really interesting ideas. Kinnear's performance is amazing. Jessie Buckley is amazing. But by and large, I found it a little less than the sum of its parts. Is that fair to say? But I'm saying that this is my review. That is what I'm saying. That is my thoughts. Yes. Let's follow this up. The 11th, and I watched The Jester 2. So I'd seen the first Jester and quite liked it. This is so The Jester. It feels, in a sense, kind of a a figure that emerged really after the success of Terrifier. Sort of these killer monstrous clowns. The Jester 2. So the original Jester really sort of strayed very close to sort of Terrifier lines, with this sort of comical character performing some really sort of nasty, violent murders. This film I'm mixed on, and I'll tell you why. But firstly, so this is about a young teenager called Max, played by Caitlin Trentham, who I quite liked in the film. She is a sort of practicing magician, and one night she meets the Jester, and through essentially performing a trick, they are tied together throughout the night, and the Jester sort of needs her for essentially to sort of sustain its own life. I won't spoil it more than that. This really had more. It did more with sort of the supernatural slasher dimensions. There are some marvelous, incredible kills that emerge from essentially magic tricks. There were some of them in the original film. I do recommend. I liked it, even though the reputation is a little less favourable. Though it brings in sort of different dimensions, different storylines and subtext that don't overly land. And this one I really liked, and I particularly liked sort of the dynamic that is established between the Jester and Max. They redesign the Jester in this film, So he still vaguely looks the same. They redesigned him essentially in the sort of the opening sequences by him pulling off his old face and having a different face. I think the new design looks less good than the original. This is my view. But I think the physical performance, so he played here by Michael Sheffield, who we played him as well in the first Jester. I found the character to be both entertaining and, if not outright terrifying, certainly creepy enough to sort of induce some scares. So yeah, no, I'd recommend. I came into this with no real expectations and was sort of very pleasantly surprised. Let me shift ahead. So I mentioned Ryan Hollinger earlier. I'm going to return to him because I saw a video released for a film, Chambre Rouge, or Red Rooms. And this is a film that I'd vaguely heard about, but it sort of passed me by. It's perhaps bad considering that sort of French language films and French films and then sort of the horror. It's kind of meant to be my thing. I suppose it's more a crime film than it is a horror film, but nonetheless. The film follows, so vaguely, there is a serial killer whose case has gone to trial, but we don't follow him. We instead follow a character called Kellyanne, played by Juliette Gariepi, who is sort of obsessed with him. And sort of the more the trial goes on, she attends and meets people who sort of believe this guy to be innocent, and her reality starts to blur. And then I'm going to quote from the description of the film here. She goes down a dark path to seek the final piece of the case's puzzle. I think that's a very fair summary. Yes, this film. It's a fascinating film. So I watched it before I saw the analysis, and it was quite pleasing, really. And the analysis is linked below as well. And how much the thoughts and how much sort of the analysis really aligned with my own way of thinking. So the character here, Gillian, is a sort of so divorced from the real world in whatever sense. She's a character who sort of lives online and sort of watches things impassively as an observer, and so connects with these cases, connects with the case, connects with the people she meets, almost in a kind of sort of observer sense. It's and there is sort of, and this sense of observer sort of trying to connect becomes increasingly self-destructive throughout the film. So the ways that she connects, she doesn't connect, she plays poker online, she's created an AI sort of as a companion. She accesses the dark web. She is sort of this person who is sort of very much on the periphery of society, and her sort of ingratiation with kind of the reality, the sort of the brutal reality of the serial killing. It leads to sort of increasingly unsettling things. And I really recommended this. I really rate this. So again, I sort of vaguely heard of it, but knew nothing of it. I'd seen the poster in which a scene in which she decides to come to the courtroom in a very inappropriate outfit. This is one that I think is best unspoiled, I would say. But I would recommend this one. I really rated. I think there will be discussion of this, especially in our increasingly online, detached AI internet world. So yes, I recommend. Gary B. Is magnificent in the central role. Pascal Plante, who both directed and wrote the film, puts together something that is really brutal, really terrifying, and really unsettling. I think this is a film that is more unsettling than it is perhaps scary. But yes, I really would rate this. Then from the reality, from a film vaguely aligned with reality to one very much divorced, the 20th, on the 20th, so I watched two films on the 20th. I watched firstly, what did I watch? I watched Jack Meskett's Midnight Movie from 2008. So I saw this and then had vague memories when I started watching it that I'd seen it before, and it started to come back to me. And this is kind of a meta slasher film. Not in the way, not in a sort of a screamy kind of way, really. So the film is a killer who's directed a film lately and has sort of screened it in his cell in a psychiatric hospital. Later on in time, and that film is screened in a sort of a sleepy cinema. Um, and the lines between the film and the reality of their reality start to blur as the killer from the film begins to be able to target them in the cinema. I Yeah, this is a fascinating. This is a slasher film. The killer is sort of imposing with his mask and his sort of drill weapon that you've not really seen anything like that about. Um, there is and the sort of the interplay between the film within the film and the ways that characters sort of engage with some horror tropes and not others. Um, it's fantastic. It sort of it works well, and the characters sort of are brought into the film that they are able to escape by essentially not playing by the logic of movies. There's some really, really interesting things here. There's a screenplay by Messid and Mark Garvett, and a really, really interesting one. Where it collapses a little bit, where it fails a little bit, is that the acting isn't particularly brilliant. There are some characters, a guy who plays a biker, whose name I don't know. I think it's Stan Ellsworth. I quite liked him, but otherwise, there's not too much in the way of sort of interesting performance in the film. There is a great degree of gore, but the moment you start to think about it, there's a lot of scripting issues, a lot of quite lame dialogue, and it there are pacing issues here definitely. The film is not even an hour and a half, and there are elements where it feels like it's really struggling to sustain itself on that runtime, even despite the fact that sort of it has quite a considerable kill count. But the quite interesting meta play with the characters, with them sort of perceiving themselves within the film, and it is one that I rate. This is an underrated film, I think, and you can certainly do worse. And as we're going to see, there are slasher films, that are markedly worse. I'll shift on to the other film I watched this day. So I went to the cinema. I saw a screening of Jess Varley's The Astronaut. So the film stars Kate Mara as a astronaut. She lands back on Earth, and she's placed in a sort of a high security house for rehabilitation, for medical testing, etc. However, stuff starts to happen around the house, and she thinks that something extraterrestrial might have followed her back to Earth. And yeah, this was a bizarre film. This is a bizarre film that had very, very little tension to it, and then wraps up in a third act twist that really kind of comes out of nowhere. Mara, to her credit, is doing sort of her best. She is the best thing about the film by a long shot. Her performance and her presence is by far the best thing here. She's joined by Lawrence Fishburne, who sort of is doing sort of stock authority figure. And the film looks great. It's very well staged. There are sort of gorgeous, a list of gorgeous shots. But it's a weird. It feels like a film of two halves almost. I'm sort of trying not to spoil what happens. But there is it's a bizarre film. It's 90 minutes, and again, I mentioned pacing for Midnight Movie. This one also feels much longer than it is. It feels like there's not really the material there for 9 minutes and the 90 minutes, sorry. And yet in presenting 90 minutes, it feels markedly longer. It's very, very, very kind of expositionary, shall I say. And there's also some quite lame CGI effects here. that I don't think worked particularly well. Let's shift ahead. Let's move on to the next thing, and this is my first lame Hallmark Christmas film of the year. So after seeing The Astronaut, recommendations took me to A Christmas Star. I'd love to know how these algorithms work. Oh goodness. Yeah, so this is your sort of your conventional Hallmark Christmas film. The premise of this one is that the central lead, a lady called Madeline, played by Sarah Canning, is an astronomer. She heads to a small town where she meets a widowed father and his young daughter, as is the way in a Hallmark film. She's there to look for sort of extraterrestrial life, and later a meteor shower. I've been trying to sort of, I feel cruel saying, but trying to sort of critically analyze a Hallmark film is kind of a tough task. What I want to say, here, I watched a second film of this variety this month, and many of the criticisms, maybe the sort of the actual thoughts that I have on it, and I don't really want to bring up here because I'm going to mention in that analysis as well. What I will say is there's a so many bizarre scripting things here. They're heading up a mountain and the mountain is completely flat. There's a station that's closed and then sort of it's fully decorated when they arrive. There's a tiny town which is apparently making so much light pollution that it's making a meteor shower not visible. Despite the fact that this astronomer came from the big city where apparently conditions were better. I am not going to say much more here. I'm going to critically analyse this when I look at my second Hallmark film of the year. Let me shift on to a film of a radically different bent, which is called They Look Like People from 2015, directed by Perry Blackshear. Again, fueled by another Ryan Hollinger video. Really, Ryan Hollinger is kind of keeping me going throughout this month. This is a film about two male friends. One of them, Wyatt, who is played by McLeod Andrews, heads to New York City to meet to look for his estranged childhood friend Christian Evan Dumichel, because he is convinced that people are transforming into sort of malevolent shapeshifters. This film, so I'm going to be honest, I struggled with this as a watch. I didn't find it particularly compelling, even though there are some sort of great sequences done with sort of digital effects. And really, this is a mental health horror in the sense of Wyatt is clearly suffering from some form of mental health problem, probably schizophrenia. I mean, he doesn't have it, and sort of essentially his actions, his ways of pursuing, sort of thinking about people are fueled by his illness. Although the film never explicitly says that, but this is very much that's my reading of it. And the horror is not so much what the people are, or what Wyatt perceives them as kind of what he is experiencing throughout the film, and how his friend wants to help him or not be able to help him. The performances are basically solid, but it sort of doesn't. I struggle with this. It's a small budget film. I think it struggles to make its runtime work. There are the scenes of this I really like. The two lead actors have sort of great chemistry. Where they're hanging out, they're sort of remembering their old friendship. Then it develops, and it seems that Wyatt is going to essentially kind of commit an atrocity, for example, has his mental health declines. It's a hard watch. On a personal note, I didn't find it an overly compelling watch. Let me say that. I think that's probably a fair description. I would recommend. I would recommend watching the video as well. Move on to Hallmark holiday film number 2. Not a Hallmark film probably, but it's very much that vibe. Falling for Christmas. So this, sorry, I went very high there. So this received a lot of traction a few years back when it came out, 2022, because I think it was Lindsay Lohan's return to, if not screen, certainly holiday films. So Lohan plays this sort of Paris Hilton type heiress, and her hotel is going essentially crushing the local hotel. She falls into a skiing accident, she falls off a cliff, she develops amnesia, and then he finds her, the guy who's running the local hotel, and his daughter, because of course it's a Hallmark film, and they look after her and help her sort of rediscover her life. What I would say, again, this is kind of it's your typical sort of Hallmark romantic film, and there's nothing more really to be said about that. That it has a seasoned performer like Lindsay Lohan in the lead role, sort of bumps it up a few pegs, just by that very nature. What I would say, so sort of talking analysis, a lot of this film is Lohan being this sort of dreadful woman, and she forgets her memory, and she essentially discovers love by effectively being trained to be a sort of conservative domestic wife. And I was struck when I was watching that, and I was watching Star for Christmas, that this is very much the overtones of these films, is that the women are encouraged to almost kind of give up on their dreams, or at least encouraged to essentially adapt and become a mother, a surrogate mother, to complete the family unit, to be whole. I'm casting no judgment on that. May agree with that or not agree with that. But I hadn't noticed how inherently sort of conservative all these Hallmark films are. And it might be the case that I'm almost certainly going to be watching some more in December. Don't you worry there, courtesy of my mother and Mrs. Goodall. And I'm going to see if this is still the case in sort of other films. But there's an inherently sort of conservative dimension to these films, and that happiness and fulfillment emerges from essentially conforming to those sorts of more classical stereotypes of gender roles. What I will say about this film is this very shifty old man as well, who sort of, I think, is meant to be Santa Claus, and the film never says it, and he's just always sort of hanging around. It was found it hilarious whenever he crops up. He's a weird character, a really, really weird character. Let me shift on to my final 2 films of the month. So Eternity, I went to watch as an Odeon screen unseen with my brother, but this is kind of a high concept romance. So the premise of the film is that once you die, you go to this kind of waiting room area, where you have a week to decide what sort of heaven you want to go to, what sort of eternity you want to go to. Joan, an old lady who, when she's reincarnated in this place, comes back as Elizabeth Olsen, is essentially forced into a hideous choice. Her husband of many, many years, Frank, played by Larry. Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying Frank. Larry, played by Miles Teller, has died sort of a few days prior and is there waiting for her. But when she arrives, she also discovers her first love, Luke, a military man who died young, who has spent decades waiting for her. And she's forced to decide what sort of eternity she wants and who she's going to spend it with. High concept romance, a really interesting, enjoyable one. Bolstered by 3 sort of phenomenal lead performances. Elizabeth Olsen, I mentioned, Miles Teller, Callum Turner plays Olsen's first love, Divine Joy Randolph as well as sort of a kind of a heavenly guide who supports Larry. Some great chemistry, sort of whatever combination of those 3 are on screen. It's really good, really entertaining. This is a fascinating film. Again, my brother and I on the drive back poked a lot of holes in the logistics of this kind of heaven scenario, this afterlife scenario, and we both had the same response. So the film is it's a touch under 2 hours long, and kind of loses its way a little bit. It doesn't quite sustain itself for 2 hours. We both thought it was perhaps a little overlong, and there's a frustrating thing in which the film very, very clearly sets up there are some rules that you can't break, and then the ending is just, well, they've been broken. There is also, I mean, I'm not going to spoil anything in terms of sort of choices that are made in that. This is really charming. There are lots of laughing moments, lots of funny moments, and some genuine tearjerkers. I very much cried at certain points. And the high concept of this, picturing heaven as a kind of sort of 1960s style, 1970s style convention booth and retro hotel rooms and stuff, or the waiting lounge, I should say, fueled by a sort of public transport system as well. It was quite an interesting thing, and although and having all these people as kind of individual caseworkers, it's a very sort of managerial depiction of heaven. I keep saying heaven, of the sort of this afterlife period, and it's quite a fascinating way to think about this life. And this, although it was, as I say, a sort of a high concept film, very much it is kind of in all other senses, your traditional romance film. I would recommend. We like this one. As I say, it made me laugh, it made me smile, it made me cry. I don't know what more you can want from a sort of a romance film than that. And let me end the month with the 5th film and supposedly final film in the Hell House LLC series. This is Lineage, released this year, directed as per all the other ones by Stephen Congietti. This film sees a return of the character of Vanessa, who appeared in the 3rd film, and who's having sort of nightmares about her experiences in the Abaddon Hotel. And death starts to occur around her, and she sort of discovers essentially all the pieces that connect the Abaddon Hotel, the Carmichael Manor from previous films, and sort of decades of people who died, and that in previous places. This is a strange film. So this is pitched as the final film in the franchise. It was pitched as the film that was going to essentially wrap up all the questions, to sort of essentially conclude the franchise on a grand high. It doesn't. It's very much the thing. And it begins really with an incredibly baffling choice, which is to take a franchise that has really, for the past 4 installments, been so effective, or so effective, depending on who you judge, but effective in using the found footage aesthetic. They've been found footage horrors. And this film sort of completely gives up on that. It throws away that aesthetic. For reasons that I don't entirely understand, for reasons that I suppose give us access to more perspectives, but really impact on the scares. And in many ways, there's some of the choices the film makes are just baffling. So if you've seen any of these films, you'll have likely seen the sort of terrifying clown creatures that are involved with the hotel and the manor and stuff. And a lot of the premise of a lot of the fright was the fact that they would move off camera and they would subtly appear. They would sort of, there's a subtle dimension. In this one, you just see them moving, and it's such a bizarre choice. It's not frightening, other than, it must be said, a sort of an opening sequence that takes place in sort of a carnival fairground game, which perhaps is the highlight of the film. It really probably is. There's so many baffling choices. So actors and that are brought back from previous films. There's a lot of reference to lore. If you haven't done your homework, if you don't remember all 4 of the films, then there's stuff here that will just not make any sense. It doesn't really stand on its own. And even if you're sort of not, even if you're very invested in the franchise, there's not a lot there to keep you going. There's all concluded with a grand finale moment that is meant to sort of give you all the answers, but just left me feeling baffled. And yes, as you can tell, my thoughts about this film are primarily confusion and annoyance. And it's not to say there weren't good things here. So I particularly I liked Sierra Sorka, who plays a journalist called Alicia, who is sort of kind of more interesting a protagonist than the actual protagonist, Vanessa. And even though she gets very, very little of sort of meaning to do. But yeah, no, I wrap up my monthly roundup of the films I've seen with just confusion about what this film was and what it was meant to be. I don't understand how you so successfully make a found footage horror franchise and completely jettison it and offer an experience that's baffling and brings nothing to the table. It's in every way just a poor approach. Yes, I'm going to finish that there. Yeah, so whereas I recommended some of these films, I would not recommend this one. If you want to watch a Hell House film, there are 4 others that are markedly more comprehensible and frightening than this one. So I wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining me for my review of my October films. As you may imagine, next month's review will be certainly a little more festive than this one, although Christmas films are definitely creeping in, but there will be many new releases as well. I'd love to hear what you're all watching. What recommendations do you have? What should I be seeing? Please do comment below, share your highlights of the month. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe, make sure to ring a bell so you've got any notifications of future videos. Thank you so much for watching and joining me here, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.